Hi, I'm Chris Oliver from the University of Birmingham. And in this brief presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of the BeWell Checklist. And this is a checklist that you can download from the Cerebra website. The checklist has been developed over the last 15 to 20 years, and it's designed to help people understand behavior and well-being in people with a more severe intellectual disability and complex needs, and particularly those people who use few or no words. So I'll just share my screen with you. And the focus of the checklist is both behavior and well-being. And the reason we developed it was because parents would often say to us, and carers would often say to us, I really don't know where to start when I'm trying to understand behavior and well-being. And this is particularly true, I think, in children and adults with more severe disability, and particularly those who use few or no words. And so if we see behavior or we see distress, it's very difficult for us to know what to start looking at, what to talk to others about, what to ask professionals for help with. And so what we've tried to do is to summarize this in the BeWell Checklist so that you are able to know the important things to think about and to talk to other people about, and to keep a record of those things over time. So the BeWell Checklist is primarily for use with people with severe learning disability of any age, people with complex needs, as well as the learning disability, and as I mentioned, in particular, those with few or no words. Just to be clear about the checklist, it is a checklist and not a list of assessments or treatments. So it's not something you can sort of work through and assess behavior and find out what the treatments are. It's really just a list of things that you need to look at, think about, and consider and discuss with other people. And it's just to make sure that those things are considered and thought about. The items that are on the checklist, there's 9 items, they have either a direct or indirect influence on behavior and well-being. They can either be changed or they can be accommodated. In other words, we can change the environment to be able to respond to difference. They are often missed or neglected, and this is a really important point. And why we have a checklist is to make sure we don't miss important things. And they are in addition to factors that are important to everyone. So choice, participation, relationships. The items on the checklist are really those that we see in people with more severe disability that tend to present differently and are often missed. But we wouldn't forget those other factors that are important to everybody. One reason we've developed the checklist is that it helps reduce diagnostic overshadowing. So this is where a behavior or poor well-being is attributed to the fact that someone has a particular syndrome or a particular diagnosis or just a severe learning disability. That cannot be used as an explanation, and we want to make sure that things are considered over and above those. And finally, the checklist certainly doesn't replace or oppose other diagnoses. So children and adults can have another diagnosis, for example, of autism or ADHD, and we're not suggesting the checklist replaces those diagnoses. What we're saying is that all of these things need to be considered alongside those diagnoses. So the checklist can be used by both carers and practitioners, and we want to try and help that partnership of coming together to work out what needs to be done next. And it can be used when there is concern about a particular behavior or about someone's well-being. It can be used when just thinking ahead about the future. What things do we need to keep an eye on to make sure that someone's well-being is as good as it can be? And it can be used at regular reviews, for example, at school, at a clinic, or with a GP. So it's got a variety of uses. and it's a good, we think is a good and useful tool to take along to those meetings. Three things first that are not covered in the checklist. The first thing is it's really important to make sure that seizures have been assessed, particularly when thinking about behaviour and well-being, and that they are treated as well as they can be. Secondly, that medication use is reviewed constantly against the background of what's the evidence for that medication being helpful for that behavioural well-being, but also all of the effects of medication, both the positive and the less positive effects need to be monitored. And finally, we think it is very important when you're using the checklist to know something about the cause of learning disability for that particular person and other diagnoses, because this can change the way some of the items present on the checklist. So it's quite important to know that beforehand. So the first thing you would do with your checklist is, if you are concerned about a particular behaviour, then the checklist helps you define that behaviour. The term challenging behaviour is often a bit too vague, but it helps you define that behaviour or behaviours and focus and share with other people on the particular behaviour that you are concerned about. And then you're able to just complete some quick ratings. So this is how frequently the behaviour occurs, but also what kind of level of support is needed for that behaviour. Now, this is just a baseline for the future. When we've got these ratings now, we can look back over the coming weeks and say, are the numbers going in the right direction? So that's really important to have that baseline to know whether what we're doing is actually working. Same for well-being. So we have a simple rating scale on which you can rate the well-being, and we give little definitions to help you do that, and keep a date next to that. And then again, you can look back and see whatever changes you've made, have they helped the well-being? Is it better now? So those are the first things that you do. And then you turn to the individual items on the BeWell checklist, and there are 9. And here's the list. Some of these will be of no surprise to you, and I'll spend one or 2 minutes just describing each of these. But we believe there are 7 characteristics of people with severe intellectual disability that can lead to behaviour difficulties and poor well-being that we always need to check. These are pain and discomfort, sensory sensitivity, anxiety, sleep difficulties, emotion regulation, impulsivity and insistence on sameness, and social behaviour. These are really, if you like, internal characteristics of people that are important to check. And then the last 2 will be a no surprise to you. It's whether a behaviour is learned and whether the person can communicate effectively. So there's 9 items altogether. And when you look through the BeWell checklist, after you've done ratings of challenging behaviour and well-being, you'll see in there a description of each of these items, the signs you are looking for, and then some notes. And the notes usually say something about how each of these items are related to challenging behaviour and well-being, but also other items on the checklist, and that's pretty important. So there's some definitions there, and then you can make a rating that that particular item is, we think important, you think important, there are some signs, or that you're not sure and you need to check it out with someone else. So it just helps you to work out which of these things might be relevant. So what I'll do now is just tell you why those 9 items are there and their importance. First is pain and discomfort. We think this is often neglected in people and missed in people with more severe intellectual disability, particularly when people can't tell us how they're feeling. And our research on Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome showed that reflux is related to self-injury in the syndrome, and we think that reflux might be a major cause of self-injury and other difficult behaviours and poor well-being across people with severe intellectual disability. Always worth checking. Reflux is also related to middle ear infections that can cause pain, of course, and things like tooth decay, because the reflux will erode the enamel on the teeth. So it's very important to check all possible causes of pain and discomfort in people when you're thinking about behaviour and well-being. Top of our list. The second item is sensory sensitivity, and of course this has been this is much more prominent now in autism than it used to be, and we do know that people can be very sensitive to particular sounds, touch, light, smell, taste, and if you're exposed to these things over long periods of time and you're sensitive to them, that will undoubtedly affect your well-being, but can also trigger behaviour. So it's important to check that there is or isn't sensory sensitivity. Our third item is anxiety, and again, this has been studied mainly in autism, but also there's evidence across people with intellectual disability. This might be important. And when you look on this slide at the signs of anxiety, on the left, you'll see that these are things in the mind, if you like, that we need people to describe to us, and often people can't. And on the right, there are signs in the body. And again, it can be difficult to spot these. And at the bottom, you'll see the three outcomes of anxiety: fight, flight, and freeze. We know about fight and flight, so it's obvious how anxiety can affect behavior, but we often miss freeze. And I think that's quite important. So clearly, being able to spot the signs of anxiety are important, not always easy, but we do need it on our checklist. There are two things that are important about anxiety. One is about intolerance of uncertainty in the future. So people can find things in the future that are unpredictable, anxiety-provoking, and that can lead to poor well-being and difficult behaviour via anxiety. The second is the development of phobias. So to give you an example, a child we knew who had showed self-injurious behaviour when they were approaching a kitchen. And this seemed rather unusual, but what had happened was the child did experience sensory sensitivity to sounds, and this kitchen was in a school, lots of stainless steel, lots of echoes, lots of noise. And because the child was sensitive to those sounds, what happened is as they approached the kitchen, they'd hear this noise, and many people describe almost pain and fear around these noises. And consequently, this led to the self-injury, and that meant the child was removed from the situation. So it's an example of how sensory sensitivity could develop a phobia of being in particular places and then can lead to specific behaviours. Sleep difficulties are common in people with intellectual disability, around 50%, but also accepted as part of having a learning disability when they really shouldn't be. The causes of sleep difficulties are often breathing problems, pain, anxiety, and learned behaviours. And at the bottom there is an example around pain. So if you do experience reflux, then at night, if you are prone and horizontal, the reflux is worse. If you're propped up a bit, it's better. Otherwise, the pain will wake you. And then we know anxiety and breathing problems can be related to sleep difficulties. But what you can see in this slide is already that two of our previous checklist items, pain and anxiety, are related to a fourth checklist item of sleep difficulties. So it's high on our list. Emotion regulation means that children and adults may not be able to control extreme emotions at particular times. When we see emotional outbursts coming out of the blue, we often think about pain and anxiety, but there can be other reasons. And just to give you an example of this, this is a poster done by somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome who was describing what happens to her when she experiences an emotional outburst that felt to her very much like angry, being extremely angry. And you can see the rise in the temperature for her. What was really important about her description was she described this as something that happened to her rather than something she did, suggesting she couldn't control it. And also after these episodes, people will be extremely sorry and remorseful, again, suggesting they can't control their emotions at those times. Our sixth item is it's about cognitive difference over and above the intellectual disability. So it manifests in two ways: impulsivity, find it very, very difficult not to do things or to wait, and insistence on sameness, adherence to routine. And the impulsivity, we think, is related to inhibition, and the insistence on sameness, the cognitive problem of being able to shift attention from one thing to another. In the little example there, what you can see is a child who is trying not to do what the naughty dragon says, but only to do what the good bear says. And children who were doing this test, those who have found it very difficult not to do what the naughty dragon said, also spent a lot of time during the day asking repetitive questioning, suggesting asking questions repetitively, and it suggested they were not able to inhibit that. It's quite important because it does tell us that people's experience of everyday demands and tasks can be really quite different, and this is over and above a learning disability. Our seventh item is social behaviour, and this does need some attention over and above thinking about autism. So just to give you an example, in people with Cornelia-de-Lange syndrome, people generally have a real preference for being with familiar people, but if they're with unfamiliar people, they do engage in very, very good eye contact. But interestingly, they often show what we call selective mutism. So this means not speaking in a particular environment, and they can become very anxious about meetings with people who they don't know. So that might be related to intolerance of uncertainty. So social anxiety is one of the most common causes of selective mutism. And so it's slightly different from the sorts of social differences we'd see in someone with autism, in that it appears that people can understand social interactions and experience them as other people may do, but find them very anxiety provoking. A slight difference here is social behavior in which people have a very strong preference for interacting with other people. And here you can see people with Smith-Magenis syndrome or Angelman syndrome having very strong drives to interact with other people. And one of the things we've shown in our research is that this can interact with learned behavior to make those behaviors more common. So those are our 7 person characteristics. And when you think about each of those, one of the things that comes to mind is that people's experience of the world on a day-to-day basis is very different. So being able to tell someone that you're in pain and discomfort, unlike everybody else, is very difficult. Experiencing the sensitivity to particular sounds, again, makes day-to-day life very difficult. And I think a very good example is the social anxiety and the impulsivity and insistence and sameness. When we think about those things, it gives us some insight into people's experience on a day-to-day basis. The last 2 items you'll be very familiar with, I'm sure, are learned function and communication. So here we're thinking about why might someone show a challenging behavior? And we do know there's enormous amount of evidence that these behaviors can be learned. And typically there are 2 modes of learning. One is where someone might meet someone or something. They show a behavior, in this example, face slap, but it could be anything else. And that leads to someone intervening. Of course it will, because you need to protect somebody. But that also means that the need might be satisfied, and so the person learns in the future to show that behavior. The second example is where someone might need something to stop. they hit out, and that thing stops. And so they learn that in the future, you may well be able to stop things happening that you don't want to happen by hitting out. And so there's lots of evidence in people with severe learning disability that this happens, but also there's a lot of evidence that it does interact with the 7 characteristics we previously described. And these can increase motivation for these behaviors, for example, when they are learned, and that's the importance of it. And our final thing, and again, this cuts right across the board for everybody, it's very important that people are able to communicate effectively. And we would argue that we understand the importance of increasing communication and the complexity of communication. But as a bare minimum, it's important that people can reliably and effectively request that something is started, stopped, or paused, that something is changed or they are removed from a situation, and that social contact, food and drink, activities and help are provided if people would like that. So this is absolutely critically important, and you can see how this interacts with learned functions, but also all of the other examples that we've thought about. So that's the BeWell checklist. Those are the 7 person characteristics and the 2 things where the person interacts with their environment. We think it's important that this is the order, so 1 through 9. We must never stop at communication and learn function. We need to think about all of these background things. One last thing I'll mention is about how these things interact. So if we think about pain and discomfort, that will then cause sleep difficulties nearly always, and it can be related to anxiety. And looking down at the bottom, a learned function. Now, if you think about the 2 examples I gave you, if you're asking someone to do something that they don't want to do and they've learned to show aggression, to escape from that, then if at the same time they're experiencing pain and discomfort, there is stronger motivation for that behavior. So those 2 things can interact. And if we take anxiety as being central, we know that this can be caused by sensory sensitivity. It's related to sleep problems, and it can be related, for example, to insistence on sameness, such that if things aren't kept the same, people experience anxiety, and then it may trigger behavior. And down at the bottom, the anxiety will undoubtedly be related to a learned function in the way I described for a phobia. And again, you can see communication is important there. For the description I gave of a phobia, if the child had a way of saying, take me out of this situation in a different way, they may not have had to self-injure. So if on completing the checklist, before you decide on your plan of action, and there is a worked example in the checklist, you can go to each of these resources to find more information. Down in the bottom, there are these Cerebra guides. There's a guide to anxiety, sleep, pain. There's one on sensory sensitivity, for example, and you can find these on the Cerebra website. You can find more information on the Find website, and you can find the original article published in a clinical journal about this checklist that gives a bit more information on each of the items. And should people want to find assessments, then they can be downloaded again from the Find website. So there are lots of places for you to go to find more information on the items. But the importance of the checklist is that you cover all of the bases when you are thinking about the behaviour and well-being of people with the most severe intellectual disability. I'll just put up this final slide, which is showing you all the people who've done the research over the years to come up with the checklist over the last 15 to 20 years. And every one of them contributed very significantly in being able to put the checklist together that's now available from Cerebra. So I will stop there, and just to mention again that you can find the checklist on the Cerebra website, and there are other resources and other videos there that I think you'll find helpful. Thank you very much.